Are the nations in your Dungeons & Dragons campaign at war? If not, why not? Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. This is the second in the politics series. I think there's going to be 3, and I wanted to do them one right after the other, so you get one video a week, hopefully. The first video is the central tension, and I'm sort of afraid it's not obvious why it's useful. It's not until you have all 3 videos, I think, that the whole picture is going to emerge. But the goal of the central conflict, let's call it that, because I'm tired of saying the phrase central tension over and over again. The goal of the central conflict is to give you an axis around which the different actors in your game, the different nations or noblemen or guilds or wizards, can pivot. And along that axis, everyone you meet falls on one side or the other. The central conflict, therefore, becomes one of the pillars of the politics of your campaign setting. And I didn't do this in the first video, let's take a moment and define what I mean by politics and also what I mean by complexity. So when people ask me, how do I get a complex political world? What does that mean? Well, I think politics are different factions represented by people who have different goals coming into conflict. I think you could probably reduce that down to different factions coming into conflict, but I wanted to put those other points in there, that each faction is represented by a person and that they have goals, and those goals are naturally going to bring them into conflict because I think it's a useful way to think of it. And what do I mean by complexity? When we talk about complex politics, I think complexity just means that there's more going on than meets the eye. When you meet a wizard in the campaign setting, he may be a wizard that the players are trying to negotiate with because they want to get their magic items identified, and he is that. When my friends Tace the Baron's wizard, when they met him, when they were first level, they were just trying to find out what these items were they had recovered, and he could do that for them. The surface level was accurate. He was a wizard. He could identify magic items. But it turned out that there was a lot more going on underneath the surface. Because there was a central tension in my campaign, along which everyone they met fell on one side or the other, it turned out that Tace was loyal to the old Baron. And that loyalty drove everything he did far more than his wizardness. So now hopefully it's clear what I mean by politics and what I mean by complexity. Let's talk about one of the most complex things human beings get up to, and that is war. We're going to talk about 2 different subjects in this video. We're going to talk about peace and war, and we're going to talk about the steady state world and the inciting incident. And one is a political subject and the other is a storytelling subject, a writing exercise. But I think you will find, if I do a good job, I think you will find that they are related, that they are essentially, for our purposes, the same thing. I opened this video with a question. Are the nations in your campaign setting at war? And if not, why not? Because I think we have a naive view of nations and warfare. If you look at the last 2,000 years in Europe, it is difficult to find, especially before, let's say, World War II, it is difficult to find more than 1 year here or there over the last couple of thousand years where there weren't some group of nations at war with another. A lot of my thinking in this video comes from a book I read when I was in college called On the Origins of War and the Preservation of Peace by a Yale professor of classics and history named Donald Kagan. Donald Kagan argued persuasively, to my way of thinking, and I'm not the only one, that we are taught how to think about war wrongly. And I'm arguing that the reason the nations in your campaign setting aren't at war is because of this thinking. We imagine that nations left to their own devices, unless someone screws up, unless someone makes a mistake or does something wrong or evil, that the nations in our campaign setting in the real world will not naturally come into conflict, and that war is this strange catastrophe that happens. But Donald Kagan argues that that is not true. War is the ground state of nations. If you do a survey of European countries, for instance, over recorded history, it's very difficult to find any collection of years where there weren't some number of them at war. And that war is what happens when nations pursuing their own interests naturally and inevitably come into conflict. That war between nations is normal, and that the exception is peace. You begin to understand what Professor Kagan means when he says we study war wrongly. We are taught about the causes of war. I just listened to an epic, brilliant, 26-hour-long podcast from Dan Carlin. If you don't know who Dan Carlin is, I'm happy to introduce him to you. He does a podcast called Hardcore History, and he did one on World War I. I think World War I is the most significant political event of the last 100 years. We are still dealing with its after effects. And typically, because he's a student of history, Dan Carlin spends a lot of time talking about how did the war start. But he does a pretty good job, actually, I think, of talking about why was there peace in the first place. So that's the question you should ask yourself. If there is peace in your campaign, why? And Professor Kagan argues that it must be because someone, and it's usually an individual, is busting their ass to keep the peace. Now, using the example of World War I, there are a couple of people that he puts forward, and he does sort of tacitly subscribe to the great man theory of history. And if you're a historian, you might find that distasteful, but we are not historians, we're dungeon masters, and the great man theory of history is very useful to us, because saying, oh, history and warfare is complex and there's not one single cause isn't really useful for us as storytellers, but saying it's basically down to these few people and their interesting personalities is very useful for us as storytellers. So we're going to talk about two characters from World War I that were responsible for keeping the peace for decades. And the first one is a guy named Théophile Delcassé, and the other one is Otto von Bismarck. Now, von Bismarck is somewhat notorious because that dude was responsible for the wars that created the German nation. And so, depending on who you talk to, he is thought of as a great war leader. But having fought those wars and having created that nation largely out of nothing, he then spent the next, I don't know, was it 20 or 40 years, the rest of his life, creating this incredibly complex diplomatic peace. Germany was surrounded by enemies, and Otto von Bismarck made it his point to play each of them off against the other in an incredibly complex web of alliances. That dude made sure that no two people could go to war with each other without Germany being on the winning side. And it wasn't clear to other people living at the time how he did it. It was so complex, it was like watching a dude play 5 different games of chess all at the same time, and then discovering that really what he was doing was just using this player's moves against that player. From Donald Kagan's point of view, the cause of World War I is the failure of the peace. There was peace, it was hard fought, and there were people working their butts off to try to maintain it. And once those people failed, once they were removed from power by guys like Kaiser Wilhelm II, then suddenly war was inevitable. And everybody knew it. All the actors on the stage all understood there was going to be a war. There's also a very interesting guy named Théophile Delcassé, who's a French diplomat. I believe he was their foreign minister. He was foreign minister of France during a time called the Scramble for Africa, where England and France were in a race to see who would end up conquering, basically, colonially, the African continent. There were these two axes through Africa. There was one that was a railroad that England was building, and another one was a trade route that the French were using. And these two axes through Africa, each one representing a different nation, intersected at a town called Fashoda. It's important to understand that during this time, during the Scramble for Africa, France and England were perceived by each other and the rest of the world as hereditary enemies. When years later, England would throw in World War I on the side of the French, it blew the Germans away. They're like, you guys hate each other. You guys have hated each other for 1,200 years. Well, the Germans hadn't noticed the change, the Entente Cordiale between France and England, and it was largely because of this one dude. Because when these two groups of soldiers, a small unit of French soldiers at Fashoda, ended up in conflict with a much larger group of British soldiers, I believe, led by Kitchener, both sides, mostly Kitchener, because that guy had the advantage, said, look, let's not start a war right now over this. We're both supposed to take this town. Instead of us wiping out the French, why don't we both, the French troops and the English troops, wait for commands from the high command back home? And back home in France and England, everyone wanted war. People on both sides wanted their nation to win. They wanted their nation to come out ahead in the scramble for Africa. There wasn't a lot of logic behind this. It's not like either of them needed Africa. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the origins and use of power in the third video. But it largely and often comes down to things like pride and fear. We imagine that nations or guilds or whatever organizations you're dealing with in your campaign setting, we imagine that they behave according to rational principles, but they're not. They're basically like people, and they do the things that people do. So both France and England are eager to go to war over Africa because they feel like whoever controls Africa will win the 20th century. But there's this one guy, the French foreign minister, Théophile Delcassé, who says, you know what, I just don't want to go to war with England over this. He had the foresight to see that Germany was a huge problem and growing, and that somebody like Otto von Bismarck, that dude's only going to be in charge so long. And what happens when he dies or retires? There's going to be a war. And when that war happens, France would much rather have England on their side. So again, Donald Kagan argues that because of this guy, because of Théophile Delcassé, just saying, you know what, I'm just going to, even though everyone around me and people above me are saying, hey, let's go to war, he writes a letter to the English foreign minister and says, you know what, it's fine, we don't care, let's just deal with this amiably and cordially. And that began this thing called the Entente Cordiale, which I've almost certainly mispronounced. I mean, I may have gotten Théophile Delcassé's name wrong. If I got it right, then Please forgive any other mispronunciations. This is the lesson of On the Origins of War and Preservation of Peace. The notion that peace is hard fought, it is difficult to maintain, and there are constant pressures trying to break it down. And you can always, in every war, find that moment where this delicate balance, the delicate balance that we call peace, collapsed. And that is where the question comes from. If there is peace right now in your campaign setting, why? Because it's down to some person, typically. And when that person dies or retires, there's going to be war. All right, so how is that useful to us as storytellers? Well, now we're going to move into the second half of this video, and it's my hope that this is going to be a relatively short and straightforward video. And the second half is covering a storytelling subject called the steady state world, and then the inciting incident. The steady state world is the world in your story before the action started. And it's called the steady state world because we imagine that it's been like this for a long time. Even though the emperor has just disbanded the Senate, Luke has, it seems, spent his whole life wanting to join the rebellion. That's the steady state world at the beginning of Star Wars. There is a burgeoning empire. It's been around, obviously, for many years. There's a rebellion, and it looks as though the empire is going to win. The empire is in charge. It has all the power. The very first shot of Star Wars is this tiny spaceship being pursued by this representing the rebellion, being pursued by this massive, huge Star Destroyer, showing us the power of the empire. That's the steady state world, and if it wasn't, this is why we call it the steady state, if it wasn't for Luke Skywalker, it would have persisted thus forever. If it wasn't for this one person, right, and we can talk about Otto Von Bismarck or Théophile Delcasse, if it wasn't for this one person, the steady state world, the peace between the nations surrounding Germany, or the hostility between England and France, we can imagine narratively, I'm not talking about historically, I'm talking about narratively, it would have persisted indefinitely. So it's up to you to think about what was the steady state world in your campaign? What was normal? What was typical? And then what happened to change everything? Now, again, I'm not advocating this way of thinking as a default for all dungeon masters and all campaigns. This is just useful for those of us that want to have a politically sophisticated game. In my campaign, for instance, which is, I think, has a certain degree of political sophistication, in my campaign, the steady state world is the rule of Ajax the Invincible. That dude has an iron. The reason there is peace right now is because that guy rules with an iron fist. And if you remove that guy, there is going to be war. Although I don't think it's obvious to the players. Right now, the players in my campaign see the three human baronies, Tor down in the south, Bedegar in the middle, and Dalrath to the north. They see these three baronies as civilization, correct. They see them all as allies, correct, because they're all bound together in their opposition to Ajax the Invincible. But they can't do too much because Ajax, his eyes are everywhere. And he has so much power, if they tried to rebel against him, he would just crush them. So, and he knows that, by the way. He's not politically naive. The players have already begun, and I'm not sure they recognize what they've seen. They've already begun to understand when they met Edmund of Bedegar, who was 13 years old and the last heir of Bedegar, the true heir. When they met him and they started talking about giving him to the Baron of Dalrath, they started to understand, hang on a minute, the Baron of Dalrath might be perfectly happy to execute this kid and take over his barony. And that is correct. That is exactly what my friend Aaron, who runs the Baron of Dalrath, what he said when I started describing to him over Facebook Messenger what was going on. And he's getting messages from the players saying, hey, here's what's going on down here in the south. Aaron immediately saw this as a political opportunity. Yes, absolutely, he considered Bedegar his ally, but he would rather have Bedegar under his control than independent. And that is exactly how actual rulers in the real world think. So the inciting incident here in my setting is, I think, largely the heroes coming across, which I didn't know they were going to do, the shield of Andrim, which is a symbol of rulership. It is a symbol of the rightful heirs of the kings of Andrim. And it's going to end up, I think, being the rallying cry around which people come because they want to oppose Ajax the Invincible. We only have a couple of weeks before there's going to be a small war between the forces of the new Baron of Bedegar, the usurper, who is evil, and Count Nicodemus, the Count of Rend. It's the first in what is probably going to be a series of battles that will culminate. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be up to the players, but will probably culminate with some kind of conflict with Ajax the Invincible. And when the players look back and they think about the steady state world, they'll think about the decades that Ajax the Invincible ran this place. And when they think about the inciting incident, that moment where everything changed, they will think about recovering the shield of Andrim. That is the moment where the game went from being just a dungeon crawl to being a political game. They found the shield of Andrim, and that path led them to the discovery that the Baron of Bedegar had been murdered, but his youngest son lived. And that was a politically sophisticated idea. It was an entire night of just role-playing and politics. None of which would have happened if the players didn't care about the usurper, if they didn't have the Shield of Andrim, if they didn't care about Ajax the Invincible, if they were purely in it for the gold and treasure. They probably wouldn't have even ended up in that situation in the first place, but having gotten themselves into that situation, they were invested in protecting Edmund. So now hopefully it's clear how the central tension informed the steady state world. The steady state world, there was an inciting incident. There was peace, and the only reason there's peace is because an individual, in this case a bad one, Ajax the Invincible, keeps everyone under his iron thumb. Iron thumb, iron fist, whatever. And that when that dude is removed from the equation, suddenly Tor and WAAGGH and Dalrath are going to be at war. Although that is far enough in the future that I'm not sure it's obvious to the players. But it's certainly obvious to those rulers. They've already started jockeying for position, although it's not clear. I don't think the players have correctly decoded it. But when they look back on the things that the Baron of Tor did, the things that the Usurper of WAAGGH did, they will start to understand, oh, this was all in preparation for a war against Ajax and the inevitable aftermath. But remember the lesson from the last video. Remember the Battlestar Galactica lesson about how in a good conflict, there are not right or wrong answers. Each point of view is valid. If Ajax the Invincible is removed from power, then all three baronies are going to want to end up being the king of Andrim. They will all fight, they will wage war, they will shed blood, and each of them will have a reason, a perfectly logical, well-defended reason for them to be the king. And this is that normal ground state that Donald Kagan was talking about. Each of them is going to be struggling for power and security and trying to save face and acting out of pride. None of them is going to want to end up a vassal of the other. So that's the second video. I think this is a relatively short video. I think we covered the subject I wanted to cover in the time I wanted to cover it. And I think you'll see that if I had the time and the energy, I probably could have made a 90-minute video with all three of these subjects tied together, but I didn't. I wanted to break it up into smaller chunks that are hopefully a little bit more bite-sized and a little bit easier to understand. So now we have a definition of politics. We understand what it means to talk about political complexity, the idea that things are not always what they seem. The wizard is also a loyal member of the Old Baron's court. We've talked about the central conflict, which is that axis along which everyone in your game, all the NPCs and factions, pivot around. We've talked about war and peace and the idea that unless there's someone working really hard to keep the peace, war is the natural ground state of nations. It's what inevitably happens when nations pursue their own goals. So therefore, it's up to you to figure out, why aren't these nations fighting? Who is keeping them in check? And then we talked about the steady state world, the way it's been in your campaign up until now, and the inciting incident. What is the thing? It doesn't have to be your players. For instance, the inciting incident in The Lord of the Rings is the discovery of the One Ring. That's the thing that starts, we've had generations of things being the way they are, but now things are going to change for good or ill. I think you can, with almost every movie you like or book you've read, I think you can identify, if you think about it, what the steady state world was. How were things for the generations, the years leading up to the moment the book started and there was an inciting incident. There was that moment where things went from being the way everybody assumed they would always be to a distinct change. Something dramatic happens and we're off to the races. It's up to you to decide, is it the players who will be the people inciting the incident that changes everything, or has that already happened, or is that about to happen and the players are going to end up caught up in the middle of it? There's not a right or wrong answer to that. I've run great campaigns where either are true. And one of the things I learned when I was working at Wizards of the Coast, they did this huge market survey that no other company in that category has ever been able to afford. And they asked role players a bunch of questions about existing intellectual properties, existing settings. They listed a whole bunch of, let's call them settings, including stuff like Harry Potter and Dune and Robin Hood and King Arthur and Star Trek. And they said, if you're interested in playing a game in these settings, do you want to play the classical heroes, or do you want to make your own heroes? Do you want to go through the classical story, or do you want a new original story? For instance, do you want to play Robin Hood and his merry men, or do you want to play your own original characters fighting the sheriff? Or do you want the battle between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham to be the backdrop of your campaign, and you and your characters are pursuing different interests and may meet the Sheriff of Nottingham, they may meet Robin Hood and Little John, but they're not the principal actors on the stage. And the fascinating thing, especially to me, who ended up working on the D20 version of the Dune role-playing game, was that the same people, your players had different answers to those questions depending on which setting it was. In some settings, they wanted to play Luke Skywalker and they wanted to fight Darth Vader. In other settings, like for instance in Dune, they loved the idea of being kind of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in the Tom Stoppard play, and the idea that Paul is out there and the conflict between Paul and Baron Harkonnen is going to happen, and they are going to play other actors on the stage working for Paul and being kind of his agents. That was fascinating to me. I would have assumed that everyone would have answered the same way and that there was a right answer, but there's not a right answer. So your players may want to be the ones who save the world. They may want to be the ones who go on the quest to throw the ring into Mount Doom, or they might want to be the ones that are adventuring in the world with other actors on the stage trying to defeat Ajax the Invincible. I think that's a good thing for the first 2 or 3 levels of your campaign to figure out. From first to third level, I think you have the opportunity to let your players run around in a low-level sandbox. It's easy for you to, and we should probably do a video on sandboxing, like an unboxing video except with sand. And it's a good opportunity for you to find out what your players are interested in doing. Give them opportunities to engage with the politics in your world, and you may find that some of the players are interested in and some of them aren't. And that's fine. Warfare is a big part of my games because that's the tradition I come from. When I played in the 80s, it was inevitable when you built a stronghold, which you wanted to do for various reasons, inevitably people were going to come fight you over it. They didn't want new actors on the stage. They're like, who is this upstart? Let's take his keep from him. And then only once you had defended it militarily was it really yours. Did you get the benefits of it? And what I learned in that process, and this informed the design of my mass combat rules, is that a lot of players don't want to play a war game when they sit down to play D&D. So you have to come up with a system. If you're interested in warfare, you have to come up with a system that allows players to opt in, that allows those players that are interested in managing combat to do it, and those players that are just interested in questing and hack and slash to do that. So that's the second politics video, folks. I think it was relatively short. We did an unboxing video for Volo's Guide to Monsters, which I have right here. We did a great live Q&A on Twitch where we went over pretty much everything in this book and talked about what I liked and what I didn't like. I liked quite a lot of it. I recommend it. I don't know if I'm going to post that video on YouTube just because you can't see the Twitch chat. I tried that before. I had mixed success with it, and I just didn't have time this time to make the Twitch chat more legible in the YouTube video, so I punted on that. But it's going to be up on Twitch for the next, who knows, months probably. I don't spend that much time on Twitch, so I think the archive of videos it has a longer shelf life than other people. So there'll be a link in the doobly-doo to the Volo's Guide to Monsters Twitch chat, which was a lot of fun. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I thought it was a blast. Next video in the politics series, and probably the last video in this series, we're going to talk about power, where it comes from and how it is used. And after that, I think you will have a complete catalog of tools with which you can make a politically sophisticated game. I hope. We'll see. There's only one way to know, and that's we get to the end of the series, and you folks tell me in the comments whether or not this was useful. Again, no one taught me this stuff. It's all just the stuff that I have learned and the way that I think over the last, 30 years. Also, I think it's time for another giveaway. We're getting really close to 40,000 subscribers, so I think maybe a giveaway that'll get us to 50,000 might be a lot of fun. I don't know what that'll be. Maybe a Fantasy Grounds thing. I always wanted to do a big Fantasy Grounds episode where we talk about how it works, and I give away the ultimate license to Fantasy Grounds and a whole bunch of content. I think that would be a blast. I think it would be a lot of fun. As always, there are no ads in front of my D&D videos. I don't have a Patreon, but I am an independent fantasy author. If you want to help support the channel, I encourage you to come by my Amazon page. There's a link in the doobly-doo. I've got 2 books up. I'm working on the third. I have no idea when the third novel will be done. I think making YouTube videos has put a huge crimp in my writing schedule, and probably the third book, Fighter, would have already been done by now. I have no one to blame but myself. The books are well reviewed. I encourage you to check out the reviews before you pick them up. Each book is $4, of which I see $3. So if you buy both books, you're throwing me $6. Until next time, peace out.